The myth is popularized. The myth took the way of poetry. Edgar Allan Poe begot Baudelaire, who begot symbolism, which begot mandragora, disembodied women, June Sparks, hardly feminized appearances of leakages, as one speaks of leakages of water, fissures in reality, flights into dreams. The tradition became enfeebled, intellectualized, sophisticated. The way was decidedly too narrow for a man to enter upon it wholeheartedly, and in fact, taking this way was delegated to some detached human faculties. The myth also took the way of the novel, but this way soon opened on to a crowded main road, such as people stroll along on Sundays to watch the fine big cars go by and to complain of the speeding. Balzac's La Liste dans la Vallée, Constance, Adolphe, Fromentin's Dominique, Flaubert's Madame Bovary, Zola's Thérèse Raquin, André Gide's La Porte Étroite, Proust's Un Amour de Swann, are successive French steps in psychological dissociation, in the degradation of the external obstacle, and in the conscious admission, which, because conscious is alien to romance, that this is in its nature exclusively intimate and subjective, a nature religious in the case of Gide, quasi-physiological in that of Proust. Parallel to these steps are D'Annunzio's Trionfo della Morte, admirable as a commentary on Wagner, Tolstoy's Anna Karenina, and most of the great Victorian novels, especially Tess of the d'Urbervilles and Jude the Obscure, and in our own time, the Platonistic novels of Charles Morgan. But following Wagner, masterpieces became less significant of the descent of the myth into matters that have been mass-produced novels. Let me repeat that. But following Wagner, masterpieces became less significant of the descent of the myth into manners than have been mass-produced novels, popular stage successes, and above all, films. The real tragic element in our period has been diffused in mediocrity. Thereupon, to be truly serious implies an understanding and the rejection or acceptance of what moves or stirs the masses. An understanding of the broad, anonymous rivers that sweep detached individuals along with a force the mind still finds it repugnant to gauge. The process whereby our literature, whether middle class or proletarian, has come to consist mainly of novels, and of love stories at that, corresponds precisely to an invasion of the contemporary mind by the now completely profane content of the myth. The myth, indeed, must cease to be the real thing once its sacred framework is removed and the mystic secret which it both divulged and veiled is vulgarized and popularized. The claim to passion put forward by the Romantics thereupon becomes a vague yearning after affluent surroundings and exotic adventures. Such as a low grade of melodramatic novel can satisfy symbolically. That this no longer has any kind of valid meaning is evident as soon as we realize how impossible it is for the readers of these novels to imagine a mystic reality, an ascesis, or any effort on the part of the mind to throw off its sensual fetters. And yet courtly passion had no other purpose, its language no other key. Purpose and key have been lost and forgotten, and passion, although the need of it still disturbs us, is now a mere sickness of instinct, seldom fatal, usually poisonous and depressing, and quite as degraded and degrading in comparison with the Tristan myth as the consequences of dipsomania, for example, must be in comparison with quite degraded and degrading in comparison with the Tristan myth as the consequences of dipsomania, for example, must be in comparison with the divine intoxication described in the poetry of the Arab mystics. The drama has been more instructive. During the Second Empire, the French middle class made a last attempt to accommodate within its social framework the lawless workings of the Passion. For the Passion survived any form of mysticism thanks ambiguously to Romanticism. Heredity, or whatever went by the name, transmitted the attenuated virus of the love potion. Literary culture kept alive, at least in a portion of youth, the want of a nostalgic coterie. And all this made up a complex which was taken to be nature itself, although it represented only a psychological, and perhaps only a physiological, remainder. The attempt to normalize passion for the middle class by recreating a form of conventional expression which would be acceptable to the social order was shown in the French drama from Alexandre Dumas to Henri Bataille. The Eternal Triangle, which served as a model for most French playwrights down to 1914, simply reduces the Tristan myth to proportions suitable for modern society. King Mark has become the cuckold, Tristan the junior lead or gigolo, and Iseult the idle, dissatisfied wife who reads novels. Here again, two moralities confront one another. The felon barons of the legend are now the supporters of the established order. They defend middle-class marriage, the laws of inheritance, convention, and a settled state of affairs. They side with the husband and are therefore slightly ridiculous. But it is the other morality which invariably triumphs, even though at the price of a pistol shot. This is romantic morality, holding the claims of love to be indefeasible and implying the superiority from a spiritual standpoint of mistress over wife. As for the love potion, an alibi for responsibility, it is now romantically called irresistible passion, and the supporters of the established order wisely lump belief in it with whatever they contemptuously refer to as a literary attitude. Eventually, even, it was no longer attempted to dispute that the distillation of the old love potion obtains encouragement from its victims. Proust, for example, devotes hundreds of pages to a minute analysis of the way this encouragement operates and of the unconscious stratagems to which it resorts. I have called all this recent literature middle class, indeed because its trend is invariably against the middle class. It has had the effect of contributing to the stability of the established order. Literature is thus employed, unconsciously of course, to ensure that the subversive desires of the individual mind shall be volatilized in sensual reverie. It is true that the morality of marriage comes off rather badly, but that does not matter, since the middle class is well aware that the institution is no longer grounded in morality or religion, but rests upon financial foundations. Prospects of inheritance, dowries, the social position of each party, business connections, and so on. There is thus a wish to enjoy the myth as cheaply as possible, and this wish is expressed with complete artlessness in sentimental films. Art has seldom worked in a more artificial and rhetorical convention than it did in American film studios during the early 1920s. It was then that the happy ending had its heyday. Every plot had to lead up to a final lingering kiss against a background of roses or rich hangings. The convention was faithful to the myth in the last stage of the latter's downfall. It allowed the complete fusion of two contradictory wishes, the wish that nothing shall be settled and the wish that everything shall be settled, the one romantic, the other middle class. The profound satisfaction which spectators unfailingly find in a happy ending must be due precisely to its resolving the contradiction of their double wishfulness. For there can be no love story unless love meets with opposition. There is accordingly an abundance of obstructions to the fulfillment of love, and it does not matter how far-fetched they are, because the wish for romanticism renders the spectator impervious to the straining of his credibility. For an hour or two, accordingly, the story can rebound and we be full of heartfelt suspense, which is what we want, but the obstruction of love must ultimately mean death and a renunciation of terrestrial goods. This we no longer want once we have grown aware of what it is. The plot maker has therefore to devise the suppression of any obstacle at some point earlier than death, and the result is the ending which novels and films commonly have. Yet the ending must also possess a poetical atmosphere that will conceal the bump back into everyday life, and that will also, as compensation for the way Romanticism has been disappointed, fill the middle-class citizen and his wife with a sense of relief. Hence, in the modern drama and the popular novel and in the films which incessantly resort to the triangular plot, the tragic idealism of the primitive myth has turned into a rather vulgar nostalgia, the idealization of tamed desires, and moreover, these desires are being redirected towards worldly enjoyments, which means that in relation to courtly love, they are being completely inverted. The religion of the troubadours lent itself to a very cunning indulgence of instinct. Instinct being excited by the very insistence on denying it. The equivocal character of the mystical phraseology of heresy thereupon brought into being as early as the 13th century a profane rhetoric of passion. And it is the spread of this phraseology in the novel and in the drama that in the course of the last 100 years has caused instinct to become the real basis of a rhetoric, the tropes of which now give it a semblance of ideality. The glorification of instinct, as the rose of Guillaume de Loris was countered by Jean de Meungs, and as Petrarch's crystalline rhetoric was countered by Boccaccio's sensual phantasmagoria, so Romanticism has brought about in our day a revolt that its leaders would like to think primitive. The object of idealization is no longer feeling, but instinct. I have in mind a school of Anglo-American novelists in revolt against middle-class Puritanism, a school including D.H. Lawrence, Erskine Caldwell, and their disciples or imitators. These writers seem to be saying, in effect, quote, "We have had enough of being made to suffer for ideas, for ideals, for idealized and perverted little hypocrisies which no longer take anybody in. You made woman into a kind of divinity, coquettish, cruel, and vampiric. Your fatal women, your adulterous women, and your women made arid by virtue have emptied life of all delight for us. We shall get our own back on them. Woman is first and foremost a female. We are going to make her drag herself to the domineering male on her belly. Instead of singing of courtesy, we shall praise the cunning of animal desire, the complete obsession of the mind by sex, and our vast bestial innocence will rid us of your liking for sin, which is but a disease of the procreative instinct. What you call morality is what makes us nasty, gloomy, and shameful. What you call dirt can purify us. Your taboos are sacrileges on the real divinity, which is life. And life is instinct released from mind, a great solar power that crushes and magnifies the prolific man, the magnificent unleashed bully," end of quote. One of these prophets has even gone the length of saying, quote, "I want to be as vital as a cow," end of quote. Possibly this new mystic doctrine of life has inspired some fine literary work, but it also has a political aspect. In curiously identical guise, it is met with at the origin of a movement no longer needing to be either examined or convicted. This movement has called itself National Socialism, Fascism, or Communism, according to the doctrinal and economic excuses it has employed in order to seize power. It denies the next world not so as to suppress the gods, but so as to use their thunder by deifying the here below. To be divested of moral personality and merged again in the cosmic flux of instinct remains a theoretical aspiration for the bards of solar primitiveness. But the practice cannot mislead us for a moment. There are no magnificent bullies, only bullies. The idea of beauty, which Lawrence supposed was still firmly operative, is the legacy of a bankrupt period. It is a debt nobody there is prepared to honor. The Totalitarian ruling caste is not going to consider itself accountable to a Platonic spirit that it looks upon as being to blame for all the trouble and as having already paid for this with its life. So much is quite obvious. It is no less obvious that when, under pretense of destroying whatever is artificial, idealizing rhetoric, the mystical ethics of perfection, people seek to swamp themselves in the primitive flood of instinct, and whatever is primeval, formless, and foul. They may imagine they are recapturing real life, but actually they are letting themselves be swept away by a torrent of waste matter, pouring from the disintegration of the ancient culture and its myths. Moreover, there is nothing truly primitive about men today. The existence of what the current jargon calls heredity in the church original sin means that we have irrevocably lost all direct touch with our origins. To plunge down below our moral rules is therefore not to abolish their restraints, it is to yield to an insanity from which wild animals would recoil. The mistake lies in supposing that the real thing, the longing for which has now become an obsession, is there to be found. It is not lying in wait for us on the far side of a surrender to enervated instinct and resentful flesh. It is not hidden but lost. The only way to recover it is by building it up afresh, thanks to an effort that shall go against passion, that is to say, by some action, a putting in order, a purification that will bring us back to the sober mean. Truly to act in this respect is not to escape out of a world deemed diabolical. It is not to kill this hampering body, but neither is it to fire a revolver at spirit on the ground. That spirit has deceived us. A Nazi officer is reported to have said, "Every time I hear the word Geist, spirit, I slip the safety catch of my revolver." To act is indeed to accept the conditions we have been given in the conflict between the spirit and the flesh. It is to strive to surmount the two antagonistic powers, not through their destruction, but by uniting them. Let the spirit come to the aid of the flesh, and so recover the support of the flesh, and let the flesh submit to the spirit, and thus recover peace. There lies the way. The eros of death and the eros of life, each conjures up the other, and each has no true end or ending but the other which it has been striving to destroy, and so everlastingly till all life and all spirit shall have been consumed. And so everlastingly till all life and all spirit shall have been consumed. Such is the pursuit undertaken by the man who mistakes himself for a god. It is the last of the motions of passion, and the exasperation of this motion we call war. The spread of passion into every sphere. The social function of the sacred myth of courtly love in the 12th century was to order and purify the lawless forces of passion. Its transcendental mysticism secretly directed the yearnings of distressed mankind to the next world and concentrated them there. No doubt it was a heresy, but a peaceful one, and in some respects productive of a civilizing stability. But its being opposed to the propagation of the species and to war was enough to cause society to persecute it. It was the Roman Church that carried fire and the sword to the provinces which had been won for the heresy. In destroying the material shape of this religion, the Church doomed it to spread in a form more dubious and perhaps more dangerous. Tracked down, repressed, and disorganized, heresy soon underwent 1,000 distortions. The disorders which it had encouraged in spite of itself, the glorification of human love that was the inversion of its doctrine, its language both essentially and opportunely equivocal, and also opened every kind of abuse, all this was bound to defy the judges of the Inquisition, and then to invade the European mind even where still orthodox, and finally, All this was bound to defy the judges of the Inquisition and then to invade the European mind even where still orthodox, and finally, by a kind of irony, to bestow its passionate rhetoric upon the mysticism of the highest saints. When myths lose their esoteric character and their sacred purpose, they take literary form. The courtly myth was peculiarly fitted to do this, since the only way of stating it had been in terms of human love, which were given a mystical sense. Once this mystical sense had vanished, there remained a rhetoric which could express our natural instincts, but not without distorting them imperceptibly in the direction of another world. And this other world, in growing more and more mysterious, answered the need of idealization which the human mind had acquired from a mystical understanding first condemned, then lost. This was the opportunity of European literature, and this alone will account for the way which literature has exercised from that moment all the way down to our own time. First over the upper classes alone, later over the masses as well, a sway unique in the history of civilizations. Nevertheless, when the dark forces had been deprived of their sacred element, the classical style sought to impose an art form upon these obscure powers deprived of their sacred form. Romanticism supervened to attack these ritualistic vestiges. Hence, at the end of the 18th century, there occurred the magnification of all that the Tristan myth, and later its literary substitutes, had been intended to contain. The middle-class 19th century witnessed the spread into the profane mind of a, quote, death instinct, end of quote, which had long been repressed in the unconscious or else directed at its source into the channels of an aristocratic art. And when the framework of society burst under a pressure exerted from quite another quarter, the content of the myth poured out over everyday life. We were unable to understand this diluted elevation of love. We supposed it to be a new springtime of instinct, a revival of the Dionysiac forces which the so-called Christianity had persecuted. The whole of modern literature took up the hymn of liberation. Why then did literature strike such a melancholy note? How is it that the novel, which for the first 30 years of this century outdistanced all other literary forms, has resulted in no more than a shifting and slippery analysis of human doubts and human emptiness? There can be no doubt that by 1930 the novel had run dry of all its sap and could only recover an ephemeral virulence by putting itself at the service of partisan mystic systems. Does this mean the end of Romanticism? Funny to me that he's saying that the novel ran out of steam in the late 1930s and this book was written in 1945. So I guess he only gave him like 5 years to write a novel that he considered worthy of the name novel, and then he passed judgment that it had ran out of sap 5 or 7 years later. Tough critic. The spectacle afforded by contemporary manners does not allow that to be inferred. The present breakdown of middle-class marriage is a delayed triumph, perverted if you like, but nevertheless a triumph, for a profaned passion. But far outside marriage, in the realm of sex properly so called, the content of the myth together with its phantoms have now invaded other spheres. Politics, the class war, national feeling, everything nowadays is an excuse for passion. And is already being magnified into this or that mystic doctrine. The reason for this is that we have grown incapable of giving up anything for the sake of something better, incapable of regulating our desires, of understanding their character and object, and of keeping their vagaries within bounds. We can no longer express ourselves figuratively. The last surviving formalities of love were swept away by the War of 1914, and I would emphasize the symbolical fact that we have stopped making formal declarations of love at the very time we have allowed wars to begin without any declaration either. We are returning to the age of abduction and rape though minus the ritual that has surrounded such violence in Polynesia. The gradual profanation of the myth, its conversion into rhetoric, and in turn the dissolving of the rhetoric together with the thorough popularization of its content, can be traced step by step in a sphere at first sight entirely alien to what we have been examining, in the gradual transformation of European warfare and its methods.